Welcome to My Precious Data, the podcast by Eddy Willems, where we explore the world of cybercrime and incidents affecting our society. In this series, we engage in conversations with Eddy Willems, security evangelist, globally recognized cybersecurity expert, and international keynote speaker. Eddy also dives into conversations with fellow experts to share insights and explore new perspectives. Together, we highlight the latest security trends and discuss preventive measures to help avoid these kinds of problems.
Good morning, good evening, good night, or whenever you're listening. Welcome back to another episode of My Precious Data. We're back with another conversation in our ongoing series, where I search for what I like to call the real cybersecurity experts. Not just anyone, but people and especially friends who have truly made an impact in making the world a safer place, at least in my opinion. Today's guest is someone I've known and respected for many years, a brilliant mind in cryptography, a true academic leader, and someone who's been shaping cybersecurity policy across Europe. Professor Dr. Bart Preneel. Bart, it's really great to have you here.
Happy to be here, Eddy.
Okay. Actually, where are we today,
Today we are at my workplace in the Department of Electrical Engineering of the University of Leuven, where also my research group COSIC is hosted. And we're in a nice park outside Leuven near the Arenberg Castle.
I completely agree. Actually, I run around the castle several times, and it's always a pleasure to be here, actually. So, a fantastic place for students as well. Anyway, and also for professors. We've known each other for a long time. Actually, I don't remember exactly when or where. Do you have any idea?
It's hard to recall. I think it must have been information security conference somewhere in Belgium in the 90s. I think it was still called information security then.
Yes.
There were a few events and probably we met there for the
first time. I'm pretty sure it has to be something like that. Yeah. Sometimes I forget all these kind of things. You have so many friends and so many events, and then you whatever. But for the listeners who may not be familiar with your work, can you briefly explain your current role at the KU Leuven and what drew you to cryptography in the first place? But that's a later thing, of course, because obviously it has something to do with cryptography, isn't it?
Well, I'm here, the head of the research group COSIC, which stands for Computer Security and Industrial Cryptography. And it's a research group with 7 professors and about 100 people in total, so including more than 60 PhD students. And we do research on applied cryptography, but also privacy and on building secure systems, both in software and in hardware. And the group is one of the oldest research groups in the EU in this area. The group was created well before my time in 1978 by Professor Rovaerts, Professor van der Wallen. And so they had the vision that cryptography would become important, and they started a group in this area.
Oh, wow, nice. Yeah, no, it goes back a long time. It's unbelievable, time flies. Now let's have a look to the evolution of cryptography. So you've been involved in cryptography for like decades now, if you look at it. So what were some of the most pivotal moments or breakthroughs you personally witnessed?
Well, I started in cryptography in 1987. It was still a very exotic topic. Yeah. Probably in the academic world, there were less than a few hundred researchers globally. And also cryptography was very rarely used. It was only used by, as they say, kings, generals, and diplomats. And it also started being used by the financial sector. So they had their ATMs and their connection network. SWIFT was also created in the 80s. It was used, but in very few places. And also the telcos started getting interest finally in encrypting or protecting communications. But so cryptography was something for very few people. There were probably 100,000 cryptographic devices in the whole world. And cryptography was only done in hardware, and this hardware was expensive. I think 10,000 euro for one side, you need at least 2 boxes to do cryptography. So cryptography was something That was for the very few.
Yeah.
And then I think the first really important development was the fact that computers became faster and cryptography could move to software. That happened around 1990, which meant that cryptography was now more accessible to anybody, was much harder to control. And of course, the other development was the World Wide Web, which meant that the internet could now be used by the masses, and there was need to protect credit card numbers. And for this, the SSL standard was created. And so in a very short time, in something like 6 or 7 years, cryptography went from a few 100,000 devices to tens to hundreds of millions of devices.
Exactly, yeah.
And at the same time, of course, governments tried to control it, and the crypto war started. So the first big debate was actually the Clipper chip, where the US government proposed a phone encryptor with a backdoor where the US government would hold the keys. So they were still trying to control cryptography. Yeah. I think then later developments that were very important was the creation of AES. So cryptography was mostly using DES or triple DES, a block cipher. And then the companies were using many proprietary stream ciphers. But for the mass market, typically DES and triple DES were being used. And then the US government decided that this was no longer adequate for sensitive data. And so they created the AES competition. And then 2 students who actually obtained their PhD in our group, Vincent Rijmen, who is now professor here, and then Johan Damen, who is now professor in Nijmegen, they created the Randall algorithm, which became the advanced encryption standard.
Yeah, I know the story, but I think this is important to tell that to the people. And not a lot of Belgians do know this, you know. This is sometimes information which seems to be lost. I still remember those times as well. Well, anyway, from your perspective, are we doing a good job implementing cryptography in real-world systems these days, or are there still too many vulnerabilities or shortcuts?
I think the short version is that it's an amazing success, although we have to be fair and say that success actually only came after the publication of the Snowden documents. Yeah. Because that made everybody aware this is really important, and cryptography was really used everywhere. So we saw, for example, a new version of TLS 1.3, which was much more robust. And we also saw a huge uptake due to Let's Encrypt in the use of TLS because they offer free certificates. And so that meant that like securing web traffic, which was designed in the mid-90s, actually achieved after 15 years only something like 10 million web servers. And thanks to Let's Encrypt, and around 2015 to 2018, and today more than 500 million web servers are offering secure communications, and more than 90% of all web traffic is encrypted. So I think we did a very good job there, encrypting the web. The governance of the certificates is a different matter. There, I think governments and some players still interfere with interception tools.
Yes, exactly. That's something which comes later, I think, in this conversation.
But at least I think it's a very big success. And in general, my estimate is that there is between 80 and 90 billion devices, applications, libraries that use cryptography. So in some sense, it's a very big success coming from a few 100,000 to almost 100 billion in a very short time is a big success. Are they all secure? Probably not. So there is some governance issues here and there. And of course, the big players and the big libraries, they're very secure. There is still a lot of homemade stuff and ad hoc stuff where there is problems with implementation. So the standards are okay, but very often there are mistakes that are being made in the implementation.
Yeah, I totally agree. Is there a specific technology that in your view has been misapplied or misunderstood in practice?
Well, we'll come back to it later, but there is a development called quantum computers since the early 80s. There is this threat that we're going to have quantum computers. And since 94, the result of Peter Shor, we know that this affects the security of about 2/3 of all cryptography deployed. So something like 60 billion devices use public key cryptography, where the key to encrypt and decrypt is different, and the encryption key can be made public, or where you have digital signatures, where you can sign with a private key and verify with a public key. So this is a very large part of deployments. And Peter Shor's result shows that they would be vulnerable to a large quantum computer. Now, we don't have one yet, but we're working on solutions. Now, in parallel, the physicists have been working on their own solution, which is called quantum key distribution. And hundreds of millions, if not billions of euros have been spent trying to develop this. And the problem is that the technology is still not mature, although they've been promising for more than 20 years that this would be mature technology, but it's still not mature. It only does encryption at something like 50 kilobits per second over a limited distance and only point to point.
Yeah.
Plus, there is many big problems in certification. How do you certify such a device that doesn't consist of code in terms of hardware or software, but mostly physical components that can be replaced, or that can be operating outside performance without you be able to check it. So in general, it's technology with lots of problems that's not mature, yet both China and the EU are spending massive amounts of money on this. And so it sounds very good in terms of marketing. It has a very high cool factor, but in practice, it can solve only like 0.1% of all our security problems, while actually in the EU, we spend more than 90% of our budget on it in terms of government funding, which is really bizarre because all the security agencies, BSI, ANSI, the Dutch, the Swedish, even together wrote a report saying, don't spend your money on this. But nevertheless, the EU keeps doing so and spending hundreds of millions on this technology. By the way, it's a cool research. And we should do cool research, but we should not confound cool research with something that's going to solve real problems. It can be that some cool research only solves problems in 20 or 30 or 40 years, but in cryptography and cybersecurity, we have very hot topics and problems today, and we should have a right balance in how we spend our money.
I totally agree as well. Well, we come back to that cryptography and all that post-quantum stuff as well a little bit later on. But let's first of all have a look to what I call, bridging the gap between academia and industry, because that seems also not always an easy thing to do, I think. So as an academic who also advises industry and governments, how well do you think the academic world is connecting with real-world cybersecurity challenges? Do you think it's working quite well, or can it be improved, or is it already good?
I think there is definitely very positive approaches and developments, and I think there is definitely a fraction of the academics, probably 20-30%, a third or so, that's working very hard on real problems and trying to bring those to fruition and also make connections with industry and government. On the other hand, of course, the reward system in academia is oriented towards find a cool problem, make your PhD thesis on this, and work on this problem for the rest of your academic life. And then, of course, if you take this approach, you don't take enough sometimes into account the developments in the real world and the relevance of this. I think we need both approaches because it's sometimes very hard to predict what will have impact. And the number theorist Hardy was very proud at the beginning of the 20th century that he was working on number theory, and he was very sure that this would never have any application. Though it turns out that actually RSA and Diffie-Hellman are consequences of developments in number theory. So I think we should have the right balance. From my perspective, I do think that academics could do a better job at certain this balance. Cryptography has become a very theoretical discipline. If you go to a crypto conference, most of the papers are full of very complex definitions and proofs. And the discussion how this actually fits to reality is typically very short, if not completely absent. And of course, it builds a scientific discipline. It's very good because we build solid theoretical foundations. But I think it's also important to spend enough time on looking at the implications of this work and also at societal implications of the work. And I think some academics are not incentivized to do this and don't do this because they're only incentivized to publish papers and get more grants to write more papers. Having said that, I think in the cryptographic community there is a positive development. We have conferences like Real World Crypto where there is 700-800 people who try to listen to the developments in real applications. And there is definitely a strong core of people who actually do create startups, who do work with industry, and who do try to solve real problems.
Yeah, that's what you see around Leuven. If you look around, you have a lot of, how should I say, startups which are actually spin-offs of the KU Leuven, I think, as well, which is a good thing. In my opinion.
It's not only Leuven, there is also
of
groups
course.
in Bochum, in Germany.
That's right.
There's Darmstadt. There is lots of groups that try to do the right thing. But still, of course, the overall picture, one could criticize academia. But overall, this balance may not be optimal. But
Yeah.
I do want to plead to have both approaches, also have people do just things, even if it's not important now. It may become important in the next 20 or 50 years.
Yeah, I agree. Are students today better prepared for cybersecurity careers than like 10 or 20 years ago, for instance? What do you think about that?
Well, I think KU Leuven had, I think I had one lecture on cryptography in the 80s from Professor Govaerts. And then I created the cryptography course in the late 90s. So I think most universities were pretty late with this. I think Gordon Holloway is an example of one that was a bit earlier. I think they started early 90s.
Yeah.
But in general, information security or cybersecurity was not seen as an important academic discipline.
Yeah.
It was not given a high priority. So I do think in the previous century, graduates were insufficiently prepared for what was going to come because it was not seen as an important topic. This of course has changed now. There is many programs that specialize in cybersecurity. I think in the UK there is dozens. Also in Belgium we now have several programs. We have our advanced master, but also there is 2 advanced masters in Wallonia. There is a graduate program. Also our normal degrees now include a substantial component as an option, or it's like 5 to 10%, and very often it's also mandatory to learn about cybersecurity and information security or cryptography. So I do think we have made a very big step forward. Is it enough? Well, it's never enough. On the other hand, it's also important that academic education should prepare you for the next 50 years of your career. And I'm still a strong believer in teaching students basic principles of science, physics, mathematics, and then let them apply this. As an example, physics was not seen as important for cryptography in the 80s or 90s, but then side channel attack came, where people use actually physical measurements to break cryptographic systems implemented in smart cards. And then you need to understand communication theory, physics, signal processing. So I do think that a very sound education in science is still the best preparation for the next 50 years. But of course, it's important that the programs do take into account the recent developments and teach students the basic principles of cybersecurity.
Yeah, exactly. I think last word about that is definitely hasn't said that about European cybersecurity and policy, because that's also a very important topic these days. I think you also played an important role in EU cybersecurity policy development. How do you view Europe's position in the global cybersecurity ecosystem?
Well, I do think we have a problem from an industry point of view, because I think there is several problems which are not specific to cybersecurity, which is, of course, we don't have a very strong IT industry. We don't have too many big tech players and very few large software companies.
Totally agree on this, seeing everything what is going on and what we see over here and what we see in the EU at this moment.
And so, of course, if you don't control the IT, it's also very hard to control the cybersecurity. You can only have add-on solutions. I think then also in cybersecurity, it's clear that Article 4 of the Treaty of Lisbon of the EU says that national security is still the prerogative of the member state, which means that actually the collaboration of member states in the area of security, in particular cryptography, has been very limited. And you see this also for startups. So there is, of course, compared to the US, we can see that like the capital you can get for the same business plan is a factor 10 less here, but also the customers. So it's still very difficult as a startup from member state A to go sell your product in member state B. And so we see that there is good ecosystems in the larger member states, because typically a cybersecurity company, one of their first customers is very often the government. But it's very hard to actually grow large-scale cybersecurity companies because they still have a very strong national emphasis. So this, I think, is a weakness of the ecosystem in terms of industry. I think in terms of research, we're actually doing very well. So the researchers are very well integrated. And I think I may have played a very small part in this by creating a large network of excellence with, at that time, 20 years ago, about 300 researchers and 30 institutions. And so everybody knows each other and there is a very strong collaboration. So I think in terms of research ecosystem, we're doing quite well. The innovation is a problem. And then, of course, we always have pointed out, and this is a debate that started by the late Ross Emerson in the 90s, that the lack of cybersecurity is also an economic problem, because there is a market failure, and if you don't regulate, there will be always insufficient investment. And so we've been more or less asking for a regulation for 2 decades. And the only regulation we've seen is GDPR, which has some requirement, imposes some requirement on state-of-the-art protection, but it's actually quite limited, and it's very often dealt with by checkboxing. But now, of course, in the last 6 years, we have seen a tsunami of regulation. It's the Cybersecurity Act, the Cyber Solidarity Act, the Cyber Resilience Act. There is DORA, there is NIS, there is NIS2, so there is now too much regulation.
Exactly.
It's not coordinated.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is a very big risk that it shifts the emphasis to compliance rather than making secure products.
Yeah.
And definitely the regulation is way too long.
Yeah, and that's also what I always think, it's not really coordinated. You have everything next to each other, but you don't have, it seems that nobody else is looking to what is already there, and, yeah.
It's of course the way EU politics works. Different commissioners want to have their own regulation. And of course every regulation is also the result of a complex political compromise between member states, between factions in the European Parliament. So I acknowledge it's very complex, but I think regulation should have been minimal, especially for the SMEs and the smaller organizations, and should probably have been more strict for the larger organizations. And there is attempts to do this, but I think this minimal concept, I don't think the EU fully understands how lightweight things should be made.
Yeah.
And so in general, I'm afraid that more money will be spent on cybersecurity, but maybe not as much will be very effective, because a large part will go to compliance checking, to legal discussions, to making sure you report things to the right person on time, rather than actually focusing on prevention and actually making sure your systems are secure. But on the other hand, it's good that there is some progress.
Yeah.
If we could do it again, I think we should do it very differently, and I think Europe has the opportunity. Every regulation is revised every 5 years, so you should probably take the opportunity and try to clean things up. That's not something maybe that this commission or the next commission can do. Yeah. But I think for the moment now, we're really in a regulatory mess.
Yeah, and that's not the only problem in Europe, in my opinion, because what's your view on the continued political pressure for encrypting backdoors, the encryption backdoors? Is that still an active threat in the EU discussions, or is it fading away? I think it's still there, isn't it?
Well, it's never ending, and in the last months there have been new communications. More or less, of course, there is different views also inside the European Commission, also between the member states. Yeah. But it seems that the pressure to create those backdoors is increasing again, and it's a battle that keeps coming back. And of course, in part we can understand this because society becomes digital, and also crime becomes in part digital. Nobody robs a bank these days, so you actually have to give law enforcement sufficient power to deal with digital crime. Now, my point of view there is that law enforcement has more access than ever, so there is lots of data being collected. On the other hand, I do think that especially big tech can do more to support law enforcement. I think they always hide behind costs or behind regulatory regimes about the fact that they're not based in country X and so on. So I do think my view is that big tech can do more to support police and to deal with problems. Yeah. Of course, because this is happening, law enforcement has been striking back. There has been a continuous onslaught, and I've been quite active together with some academic colleagues trying to criticize this and to show the problems of this. One example is the eIDAS regulation, where there was actually a kind of an attack on CAs to prevent them from more or less, or make it harder for them to block fraudulent certificates. And then we got the CSAM, Child Sexual Abuse Material Detection, which was trying to impose client-side scanning in a very subtle way, but more or less it was kind of forcing that everything should be scanned. Yeah. And then 2.5 years ago, the Going Dark working group was created by the Swedish presidency, involving mostly departments of Interior, so DG Home and DG Justice. And of course, they have a very one-sided view of the problem. They just say, give us access to all the data. Yeah, and what has happened inside the Commission is surprisingly a bit that last April, the wish list of this Going Dark group has now become the Commission position, which means we have to have more access. In spite of the fact, for example, that the High European Court has said that having access to all metadata of all users all the time for something like 2 years is disproportionate and is violating fundamental rights. More or less, the going dark group comes out with a statement saying we need access to more metadata. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is more access for law enforcement to all information they want. And then the third thing is a working group will be started up to help law enforcement get access to encrypted communications. And so the framing of this debate is already quite wrong. I think the framing should be investigate to which extent it's possible to give access to encrypted communication or storage without violating fundamental rights and without creating mass surveillance tools. But the framing of the group is more or less how to make this access feasible and seen as a technical problem with a technical solution without looking at the broader implications. And so this working group, people can apply for this by 1st of September. I probably will. And then there will be a very intense debate, I presume, in the next months about this question. But it's a never-ending problem. Yeah. And the main problem is that there is not really an open debate. In the sense that, especially law enforcement, never comes with hard numbers. And that there is no transparent discussions. You can say what you want of the US. The US, of course, has large investment in spying on everybody. Also, FBI, CIA also do lots of spying, so also domestic and international outside the NSA. But on the other hand, at least the regulation is debated extensively in Congress. And experts are invited and there is open discussions. While in the EU, for example, as a consequence of the Snowden revelations, the boss of GCHQ was invited, he didn't even show up. So this is where we are in the EU.
Well, you know, it shows the problem. I totally agree. You know, I've been always against mass surveillance, and I'm really behind what you completely say at this moment as well. But I do think that a lot of people just don't see it, you know, and then they see something coming up in the press which is maybe not in the good, well, not good mentioned in the press or whatever, or not explained well, and that gives them a completely bad view on the whole topic. But anyway, let's hope it continues in the right direction. But let's go on a little bit on even on that privacy surveillance and all that digital trusting. Do you think that the generic public understands the real world consequences of weakening encryption, for instance, for national security? Do you think that they really understand that? Because we know what we talk, and possibly the listeners which are going to listen to our podcast maybe as well. However, there could be a part which is just listening just to find out what is going on. Do you think that, the general public, what do you think about that?
I think on the one hand, people have kind of accepted that to survive or to live as a digital citizen, that you have to give away lots of information. This has been the business model of big tech, so they more or less sell your data. I do think, though, that there is still a difference, although there is collaboration. We know this from the Snowden documents between governments and big tech. People still see a difference between government, which also has monopoly on violence. And so I do think if you actually talk to people in detail about this, that they do understand, for example, that they don't want governments to do things like client-side scanning. Especially if they explain them, this is similar to actually having a camera in every room of your house to make sure just you're not doing anything wrong. And of course, it's terrible if you beat your spouse or your children, but this is not an excuse to put a camera in every household. And I think if you explain people things in this analogy, I do think they understand this. Of course, law enforcement tries to model the debate and make it very technical and claim that it's very selective. Always the big debate is selective is okay, but mass surveillance is not okay. But of course, then the debate ends up in very complex technical discussions, where then, from the Commission point of view, the view is we should not regulate technology, we should just set the goals. But of course, our experience is that such kind of debate can only be had if you actually discuss technology in detail and look at all the weaknesses and strengths of each solution. I think that's the problem, that of course once you have such a debate, it becomes indeed very hard for general public to evaluate what's happening. But I do think that they then trust experts to some extent to make this debate. And I think if you have, as law enforcement, a good argument and you can show why your solution is adequate and experts confirm this, I don't think there will be a problem.
True. Okay, let's go back to that post-quantum cryptography subject. I think that's very important as well. So how real is the threat of quantum computers breaking today's cryptography? And when should we really start worrying, or is it already too late?
So quantum computers have been conceived in the early 80s, and there has been now 4 decades of research. It has taken about 1 decade to build a single gate or a single qubit, but even then it was noisy. And then around 2001, people managed to make the first circuits. So they claimed it was factoring, but in fact the solution was more or less built into the code, so it was not really factoring. Then it took another 20 years, 2023, Google actually made the first non-noisy qubits with error correction. So this is 1 qubit. And to threaten public key cryptography, we need something like 2,000 logical qubits, which are error corrected. And the estimate is that this requires something like a bit less than 1 million physical qubits. So we're still very far away from this, because the biggest computers today have 100 to a few thousand qubits, but the bigger they are, the more noisy they are. So it's not even clear that those bigger ones are actually performing better than the smaller ones. So I think any realistic estimate says that even with a huge investment of billions, it may still take 15 to 20 years before we can do this.
Okay.
It may also be that it's never possible, that it's like fusion, that it keeps getting delayed, because it turns out that there's new problems that come up and there is big scalability issues. But I think to some extent, the answer to this question is irrelevant, because governments have decided that we can't take the risk anymore.
Exactly.
And so you now have to behave as if such computer will be there by 2040. And then this means that if you encrypt data now, and it is stored, which is the case, if you send data today, if you have the Snowden documents, then you know that this data will be analyzed by the NSA and GCHQ. If it's encrypted, they will try to decrypt it. If they can't decrypt it, they will store it in Utah for the NSA in the hope that they can decrypt it in the future. So if you have long-term secrets, and governments do, governments have secrets for 50 years and more, then it's already too late. Because, in fact, if you still use the old systems today, like RSA, you can be quite sure that it will be read in 2040, only 15 years of security. So more or less the main message is you should start migrating today.
Exactly,
For critical systems, the advice is try to migrate by 2030. For less critical systems, the current advice is try to be done by 2035. That sounds like a lot of time, but in fact,
but it isn't.
It's actually very short, because we actually now have 60 billion devices and libraries to migrate.
That's
and
the
probably
problem,
a third of those will never even able to migrate. You just have to phase out.
Exactly.
So, but it's a huge software engineering and transformation process, and also hardware engineering process. And I think it's kind of a daunting thing, because we've never had to do this. I mean, we had, of course, cryptographic incidents like the MD4, MD5 break, but even then, cryptography was not that widely used. Now it's widely used, and migrating it is a challenge. Some things are easy. For example, if you look at TLS, Cloudflare releases measurements and shows that even today already a third of TLS traffic is post-quantum secure. And in some countries like Bulgaria, it's more than 50%. So it seems that of course, Cloudflare is only the top websites, the high-end websites. But it seems that actually for communications, we will get there. Where are the challenges? Embedded devices, PKI infrastructures, and many complex systems. So we also have introduced quite complex cryptography, where we don't even have a solution yet today. So even if we say, okay, we want to migrate, well, there is no solution. And overall, the problem is that it's going to cost a lot of money, and there is no business income. If the business people ask, okay, we do this migration, it costs us $1 billion. What added value do I have? Well, I will have the same as what I had before. So in fact, only regulation will force business people to move, because nobody's going to move for a problem that will happen after your retirement. And so this is what's happening now. The EU has been very slow again. So NIST has made timelines available, has worked on this. I mean, researchers have been fast, because I had my first student on this topic working in 2000 already. So the first conference was held in Leuven, 2006, post-quantum crypto conference. So the standards were ready, or the competition started 2018. The standards are ready since about 2 years, published a year ago. So we are there. So there is a very good story that the technologists have done their work. There is still many challenges in the migration, and there is still also some technology work to be done. But it's a wake-up call to not delay this.
Of course. Let's go to something different a little bit. So what I call the memorable moments and professional challenges. So in your long career, what's one case or moment that really challenged you? So either technically, politically, or ethically, whatever, you know, something you think, yeah.
Well, ethically, of course, I was still quite junior, but when I was in the US, actually 93, 94, then the Clipper chip happened.
Oh, yeah.
And so, of course, that kind of made it clear that, well, you're doing mathematics, you're building systems here, but in the end, there is a conflict with governments. And I think at that time, I think I was very motivated to be engaged in this. Of course, I was a bit careful because I was on a visa in the US. It was not as dangerous as maybe it's now, but at least I was more careful. But at least I got aware of this policy dimension much more. And I think that made me actually very alert to this, and this made me also later be very involved. It may have even started earlier because as a PhD student, I was involved in the European project, the RIPE project, but actually it was stopped by Secret Services.
Oh,
so RIPE stands for Race Integrity Primitives Evaluation. It was submitted to also look at confidentiality. But France, Germany, UK, and Netherlands, they stopped the project and they removed the confidentiality, and it could only continue like this. This was 1987, 1988, just when I got started. So already then I realized that this is a field where there is very touchy people, and you may actually get into trouble with government, and it's maybe important that academics take the lead and make sure that something can happen.
Well,
I think another more technological development that really was spectacular was the attack by Professor Wang on MD5. So we knew already that MD4 and MD5 had problems, and KU Leuven, for example, my colleague Anton Bosselaars played a very important role in this. So already we had papers in '93 saying there is a problem. It meant even in '95, Microsoft said stop using MD5. That would not stop. So that would not stop Microsoft in 2004 from having 900 users of or 800 users of MD5 in Windows. And then there's this professor that nobody knows, very brilliant, but obviously his English was not very good. She comes at this conference in cryptography at Santa Barbara, so the RUMP session in August. She gives a 10-minute talk in which she shows how to find collisions for MD4 by hand and for MD5 in 15 minutes on a laptop. And then people stood up and gave her a standing ovation. And of course, all the people from companies immediately started calling their bosses and saying, we have a major problem at hand.
Of course.
So I think it's not something you'd like to see as a cryptographer. It's a system that is widely used. Luckily not as widely as cryptography is today, but still widely used by hundreds of companies in thousands of products, where there is actually a realistic attack in something like 15 minutes. And so it's like a meltdown of cryptography. And so I hope we don't have to see this again, because it's definitely quite spectacular.
I completely understand. So let's have a look to the well, maybe next generation of cybersecurity leaders. What advice would you give to young researchers or students entering the field of cryptography or cybersecurity today?
Well, I think it's always important to try to do relevant work, and from both academically but also in industry. So try to have an impact. And academically, of course, you can only have an impact if you go very deep in an area and you're really the expert. On the other hand, I would say also have a broader view and try to understand the broader context. Not only the mathematics of your field, but maybe also the other field, because cryptography is now so specialized, it becomes very hard. I mean, just to give you an idea, when I started in cryptography in 1987, I probably read something like 20 books, which is 3 or 4 textbooks, and then all the proceedings of that, all the conferences that ever had happened, and I knew as much as I had to know. Today, there is more than 2,000 papers per year on cryptography.
That's what a change.
And some of these papers are 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 pages. So it's kind of impossible to still stay up to date with everything. But in spite of this, I think a challenge today is to be expert in your field and still be broad enough to understand all the other developments and try to find out where things are going. I think, and for professionals, I think it's even more important that not only you should master the technical disciplines, understand the issues with cryptography, with network security, with intrusion detection, with the use of AI and so on, but also understand the legal, of course, because you don't want to end up in legal trouble, understand the economics, because you want to still make money or you have to have a business case, the psychology, because your system will be used by people and how people behave is quite challenging, and then in general the broader geopolitical context.
Yeah.
And so I think, of course, this is kind of more a generalist that you have to be. But I think it is possible to have a broader understanding, but it requires, of course, that you spend quite some time on this and you keep educating yourself, because these things, of course, change all very quickly.
Yeah. That's also my advice as well, actually, if I would have the same position as you, actually. That's right. Yeah, completely agree on that as well. Are there any skills, like, well, beyond just the technical skills? Well, you have it already said, I think. You need to know a lot about everything, isn't it? Is it maybe interesting to have an helicopter view? Is that what you also mean a little bit? Because that's something which, in my opinion, is also very important, to have that helicopter view of everything what is going on. Otherwise, you can maybe miss some of the stuff which you are interested in, isn't it?
For sure, I think it's very important to have a broader understanding, but I think this is actually quite difficult now. Because there is just so much information. I mean, you can't listen to all podcasts, you can't follow all news sites, you can't be everywhere. So the question is, can I, with limited time, because of course you still want to do your real job, you don't want to spend 6 to 8 hours per day on social media, can I spend limited time to actually understand quickly what the developments are? I think this is a very important skill. And maybe something I've missed as well is people skills, of course, because you can't actually know everything yourself. You have to have a network of people you can contact and say, hey,
very
there is
important.
Something happening in this field. Can you assess this for me, or what do you think about this? Same thing with legal developments. And there is some people who are intimately familiar with what's happening at the EU level. It's their full-time job. If you can talk to them once in a while to find out what has happened, that's much better than trying to catch up with an endless stream of data.
Yeah, true. But that's what I always do, of course, is try to find, well, if I don't know it myself, I try to, find somebody in my network who has also the knowledge or whatever, who can, help me out of it with it. True. Personal reflections. Over the years, how has your own view of cybersecurity and cryptography evolved? Is there...
Well, I think cryptography has become much more scientific. So as I said, conferences are very much into science, and sometimes it makes it also a bit less interesting in the sense that, the cool applications or the connected application is a bit lost. But of course, it's a very solid science. I think cybersecurity is not really a science. It's not very scientific. There is a lot of focus on hacking, on ad hoc things, on management things. But in fact, it's not clear there is a science of cybersecurity. And a paper was written about this by Paul van Oorschot and others.
Oh, it's interesting. Oh, okay.
We actually are not very good at making it into a discipline. Of course, it's very hard as a discipline as well, because it's in between engineering and human science. And so it's probably not as easy to make a discipline, but I do think we could do a better job at extracting principles and teaching those and studying those. It's a little bit always the alarm of the day, and like all this threat analysis and threat hunting, and it's very much looking at the phenomenon at the surface without actually looking at the deeper problems. And I think we should probably, we have this wave. I think in the previous century the focus was on prevention, then we got the detection hype, where you have to just stop protecting things, just detect everything and react. I think we should probably have a wave going back and focusing more on building secure systems. But of course, that's a very hard problem.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't give you immediate rewards, like hacking a system or detecting an intruder. That's something that gives a quick dopamine fix. While, of course, long-term solutions, long-term thinking in secure architectures or secure designs, I think this is where we should focus.
Security by design is indeed very important, but that's an underestimated, subject, I think. If you were starting your career today, would you still choose the same thing?
I think I definitely don't regret my choices. But maybe, I'm going to echo what Adi Shamir said, maybe we should have now start in biology, because maybe this is now where the really interesting things are going to happen, because in the next 30 to 40 years, we'll probably be able to build or build, for example, regenerating organs, or really start hacking the biology really as it is, like we started hacking computers in 40 years ago. Maybe we can now hack biology, and that may actually have more impact than the AI we're doing, because of course AI is also exciting, but it may have some limits. But it's still the case that our biological systems are much more efficient in terms of watts and in terms of resilience at least for a while. It turns out that after 60 years, they kind of degrade for the humans, or 70 years. But it seems that actually studying those systems, we probably now have technology to study those and try to figure out things there.
Yeah, that's interesting, because actually I started with writing a book about something similar like this. So, okay, but I'm not going into detail about that one because it's not completely written as well, but I think it's interesting. Okay, anyway, let's go to the final thoughts and what I always say. What's one thing you wish more people understood better about this space? Is there one thing, what people should better understand?
I think, as we mentioned before, there is still too much focus on incidents and on threats and hot topics, and of course, this is what gets you attention, and of course, it's important to deal with incidents.
Yeah, but it's giving maybe more to much attention, and I know you're fading away from the real problem.
And I think the other thing which I'm a bit surprised about is that there is clearly also nation-state interests that affect things like the zero-day market or certain regulation, or the fact, for example, that we still don't have secure phone calls. This is a deliberate government decision, which then ironically after Seoul typhoon, then the US government makes a memo saying that you should no longer use phone calls for your government conversations. But it's actually backfiring a decision they made 20 years ago to make sure that actually mobile phone conversations are not encrypted end-to-end. And so I think this is something that is still the elephant in the room, which of course I understand if you're working in industry or government, you can't always mention this elephant because that may cost you your job. But as academic, of course, I can do this.
Yes.
And this is still something that is baffling, how little open debate there is about this, about the role of state, the role of intelligence services, how this actually shapes the ecosystem, and sometimes lead to very bad decisions, but they can't be mentioned, or they can't even be discussed.
Well, I try to mention it also from time to time during my lectures. So yeah, but indeed. And now it's a typical thing which always come back in this kind of typical podcast, This is what we call the $1 million question to me. So we're turning, and actually I have a little bit fear, because most of the time I know pretty well what people are going to ask me, but you never know. But what would you ask me? If you would ask me one particular question, what could it be? It could be anything,
It will not be a math question.
Okay.
So what I would ask is, if you can do one thing to improve the state of cybersecurity, what would you do?
It's actually what I'm still doing. It's just improving security awareness, but in a much more, organized way. Because at this moment we, doing this not implementing this, in my opinion, in education. But we should do that from, the beginning, from the start. And that's, I think, which can solve not everything, but at least part of the problems we still see today. So if we can put, more possibility in education from the first grades of school or whatever, and if we could implement something like that, just the security awareness we need, because it changes all the time as well, that could help us. What do you think?
Definitely, and I have a brilliant PhD student who is actually a professional who came to do a PhD, and his research question is, which security advice do experienced cybersecurity professionals give to their children to be secure and private online? And I think that's already very interesting, because we try to find out what advice you actually should give.
Yeah.
Because one of my gripes is there is a lot of money being spent on awareness, and also governments decide to send messages even on national TV. But then if you ask which science has been used to validate that this advice is the correct advice to give, or how much science do you use afterwards to measure whether or not this has impact. I think the measuring of impact now happens more, but the advice or the science in selecting the advice.
That's the academical way.
Well, this is academic, but it's actually what you should do because
Exactly.
you're spending a lot of money, so you should actually
But
make sure.
that's also what I was in my mind, actually. So having the academical feedback and then use that as soon as possible when you have the possibility to do that. Because if you now try to train people in businesses, it is okay, but even they make mistakes and they still keep going on making mistakes, and it's not finished yet. So the only way, and even if I see even younger people, they still make also a lot of mistakes with their security awareness mentality. So that seems to be still wrong.
But let me push back a bit on that. I mean, I'm of course, awareness is important, right? If people do stupid things, then cybersecurity will be bad. Yeah, but my analogy is that, we should build a more robust infrastructure, because cybersecurity awareness is, if you look at building security, it would be saying, here is a door, and it says, don't enter to this door. And you put a sign there, maybe a sign there is high voltage or whatever. But you know for sure that however much you train people, somebody will open this door. And what happens in the real world, you open this door and there is some dust, or maybe the person sees that there is danger. In the cybersecurity world, if somebody opens the door, the whole building collapses. And then people say, well, you were not careful. I think we should build buildings that don't collapse if a user opens the wrong door.
Security by design.
Exactly. I think this is definitely should be in balance, because I think blaming the user if we train more the user is going to solve the problem.
No. That's also what that's also what I said. So it's just part of the whole thing. It's security by design is actually one of my key points also as well. The problem is, of course, it's very difficult, I think. But developers should make at least the right decision.
It also has become a very dangerous term, because law enforcement now uses this term and says security for society by design, so we want to have a backdoor. We consider that they now redefine security by design as having a backdoor by design.
Exactly.
And so you have to be very careful with this, that it's clear to everybody what is meant, because law enforcement has now figured out this is a popular term and they can use it to push their agenda.
True, yeah. Okay, is there anything we haven't covered, you think, during this kind of interesting talk and podcast?
I don't think so. I think we went everywhere, more or less.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think it was really wonderful. I think we covered a lot of stuff. Completely something new parts, which I learned as well, because I'm not a cryptologist. So I think this was very informative for me as well. So Bart, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really a pleasure, and I've learned really a lot. So I wish you a cyber-safe continuation of your work, and let's hope that the mission to secure our digital world continues to move forward, even if the challenges grow by the day. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on My Precious Data.
Thank you for having me, Eddy.
Thank you.
If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, feel free to email us at podcast@wavci.com. For more information about lectures or keynotes, please visit wavci.com. See you next time.